Domain still queen? Which of the kindred archetypes, if any, made it into this week's tiers? We're doing some soul searching, spelunking into the caverns of Ixalan. Like this video and subscribe so you can find out the answers to these questions and more as we enter the new era.
It only matters if it ladders. Comment below as we walk through the Week 1 recap of Standard and Ixalan. And we're back with limited tournament results to base these on this week, as we're releasing this video before Sunday's MTGO Challenge results are in. Nonetheless, let's start off with the general shifts. Now, we can see that Azorius Soldiers and Esper Midrange hung on to Tier 1 status in our first week, but more importantly, we see the return of Mono Red along with newcomer Boros Aggro enjoying some success.
In Tier 2 lane, we see where Domain landed, along with Rakdos Midrange returning to prominence once more.
And lastly, we split up 8 different lists for Brewer's Corner and are featuring the top 4 from our internal testing. There's definitely some spice to be had, but for now, let's start by breaking down the Tier 1 archetypes. Surprise, surprise. The King has returned with yet another trophy to kick off the new meta. Congrats to Remph on pushing through the competition on week 1. Much has remained the same in this list, but we see the inclusion of a few new cards from Ixalan. Now, for instance, we have Malcolm Alluring Scoundrel appearing for the first time, and that is something that we predicted a while ago, due to its versatility in card selection, evasion, and flash. In the sideboard, you'll note that Get Lost has made an appearance, highlighting where this card most likely shines, these tempo-esque shells. Now, Max, I look at a deck like this and I'm noting that we have fewer soldiers than ever before. We are almost eschewing soldiers at this point. It's literally down to just Harbins, Zephyrs, Resolutes, and Recruitments. Nothing else is a soldier here. Does the deck just shift out of it entirely? Are we at that point?
I think we really are. I think it's become a flash tempo list with just a slight tether to soldiers, definitely. Now I have a question for you. We have discussed this deck quite a bit. It's evolved, it's adapted quite a bit over the past few weeks. So I really want to get into one of the more common matchups. How does this deck sideboard against a deck like Mono Red, and what weaknesses, if any, does it need to shore up in that matchup?
So I think with Mono Red, they are looking to take advantage of the fact that you are trying to play like this game of either we're going to play a creature or we're going to counter, and Mono Red's like, don't care, playing it anyway. Like, you just have to have it every single time, right? And so that's kind of their game plan, and they really get a lot of points by not caring what our game plan is at all. Where we get those points back is by having cards like Lantern Flare, Wandering Emperor, and Surge of Salvation in the sideboard. So those 5, I think, are going to come in with a potential for a Lauren if we see weird stuff like Urbrask's Forge. They shouldn't be playing it against us, but sometimes Mono Red players do anyway. Point being, those 5 are going to come in. You're going to probably end up boarding out some mixture of Wedding Announcement and Make Disappear, because those are likely the worst cards in this matchup. Like, Wedding Announcement, you'd think it'd be fine, but often you play it on turn 3, the game's over by turn 5. So you're not getting that full benefit often. My guess, though, is that Make Disappear is going to be the card that gets cut first, because having counter spells in this matchup is mostly irrelevant. Like, you have to have them on turn 2 right when you need them. If the game lasts any longer against Mono Red, I mean, you're just gonna have dead counters very, very quickly. So my guess is you lose like 3 Make Disappear and a couple Wedding Announcements, and that'll be the split for the 5 coming in.
That I actually like that game plan, and yeah, Make Disappear doesn't have late game relevance like it does in other lists. You can't just like cut a token to pay for it and make it worth your. So yeah, cut it. All right, let's look at another tier 1 Esper Midrange.
So, apologies if I butcher the name. A 2-star made it to the finals of the MTGO Challenge with this unique take on Esper Midrange, and honestly, I couldn't be happier to see the shifts. Deep Cavern Bat is here. Oh my god, I'm so happy this made it. It is a 4 of 2, and it's here to remind us that Kite Sail Freebooter was a house in the first set of Ixalan, and this is just an upgrade in most ways. Also noting that Subterranean Schooner, I think that's how you pronounce it, makes an appearance as well, highlighting the power of combining this with those 1/1 tokens from Wedding Announcement. So you can just crew this with the bats, you can crew it with the tokens, and as you're doing it, you're either grabbing lands off the top or you're growing it. That is fantastic in a deck that wants to be tempoing forward while also having a little bit of versatility for cards like Sunfall. Last but not least, there is a Get Lost in some of these sideboards. There's also a Get Lost in this main board. I like that it's a single slot here that highlights the tempo that this deck is choosing to pursue over raw power now that Shieldred has been relegated to the sideboard. This is just a beautiful build. I'm a huge fan.
Speaking of Shieldred being relegated to the sideboard, I know that you and I in the past have been caught saying, that decks with Shelly tend to win more, especially in past weeks. But just one thing really popped out at me, especially with Cavern of Souls getting a lot of play, is that against control, does something like Urtai go down in stock value overall against the meta in light of Caverns? And would you advise putting Shelly back in the main board, or maybe not? What's your opinion on that?
So I think the important thing to note with Urtai is that the decks that are playing Cavern are not also playing counters. They're playing creatures, which Urtai can blow up. It's not ideal to have to go to that mode with Urtai, but the fact that it has that versatility where against the aggro decks that play Cavern, you blow up the threat that they cast instead of countering it. And then against the decks like Domain, you do want those counters. Like, you do want Urtai to be there to say, no to Sunfall, and now you're dead. And that is really where Urtai shines and where Shelly has that issue. Shelly is going to be better against most of these Cavern of Soul decks typically because they are lighter on removal, they are heavier on the threat base, and Shelly can hold the fort down better than any other creature in Standard. That said, it's just going to be a meta call. Do you expect Domain? Do you expect Control? Do you expect Midrange? If so, Urtai starts to really look great. If we see a ton of Cavern of Souls decks, Urtai looks slightly worse, not because we worry about the counter, but because the life gain off Shelly becomes far more relevant in an aggressive meta.
Yeah. One of those matchups you have to worry about. Mono red aggro. Talk to us about it.
So, DeLeon91 led the charge into the top 8 of an MTGO challenge backed by 2 more copies. While not one of them made it to the top 4, the fact that 3 slots in the top 8 were taken up by Mono Red establishes it as a tier 1 for this week 1 recap. Now, we're not seeing a single card from Ixalan in this build, and we're not really seeing any shifts from past iterations, unfortunately. So there's not much to comment on other than to say that, per usual, Mono Red is there to ruin the clunky experiments in week 1 of our metagame breakdown. And honestly, God, Max, I think that is why this did as well as it did. I don't think it's because this deck got any better. I don't think it's even because the meta got better for it. I think it is because for opening week, you play aggro. You know what I mean? So many people are trying out clunky things, and here is a tuned list from last season that just comes in and eats their lunch. And that's what I see happening here.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. I did happen to see another iteration of this in the same challenge by Troubled that actually went more creature-based aggro, eschewing some of the non-creature cards and Bloodthirsty Adversary for, I think, like 4 copies of this new card, Miron Bane Splitter, which is a one-drop artifact equipment that automatically attaches. Which do you think is a better option for Mono Red right now in the beginning weeks of Ixalan? Creature-based aggro, or the Monastery Swift Spear and burn-based aggro?
Well, I think it really depends on how aggressive you think you need to be with Mono Red. Like, can you afford to have more of that grind? Because Bloodthirsty Adversary gives you a lot of grindability against other archetypes. But if you are just all in balls to the wall aggro and you are trying to get them dead red as fast as you can, then Mirren Bane Splitter makes a lot more sense because you're trying to apply pressure at a faster pace. That said, I don't personally love the Mirren Bane Splitter. If I'm going to play Mirren Bane Splitter, I want to play it in a deck that's running cards like Picnic Ruiner so that we can attach it, and all of a sudden it amps the damage from 2 to 8. Like where it's kind of a weird mini wombo combo. That's where I like Mirren Bane Splitter. I don't love it in just your conventional aggro archetypes.
Speaking of conventional aggro, talk to us about Boros Aggro making an introduction here, tier 1.
Finally, a brand new archetype to embrace, and it took 4th place in the MTGO challenge, piloted by Hamuda, while also snagging 9th and 10th place in the same tourney. Now, there's a lot to cover here, so let's start with some basics. First, this isn't just Boros Aggro, this is Boros Humans, and those Cavern of Souls are putting in some serious work here, making those opposing make disappears at bay while you just establish your board presence. Second, Get Lost is a 4 of in the main, and it has never looked so hot before. This is a deck that can absolutely do that, because you are putting on such pressure that the fact that they have map tokens is basically irrelevant. They don't have time to use them. They're not going to have time to use them. If they do, you probably already lost the game. Third, Anim Pakal, Thousandth Moon, is a sweet mini combo with Inti, Seneschal of the Sun. This just craps out value for you. Think of Anim Pakal as the new Goblin Rabblemaster, and I don't think you're going to be too far off. Like, this card has such Rabblemaster vibes, and the fact that you don't have to swing with it the turn it comes out to get that value is kind of insane.
Definitely a deck to get excited about. This is a fast new strategy being introduced to standard meta. I see 4 copies each of the legendaries in here. Some slots that I might like to see shifted myself. But what, if any, additions would you make to this list to make it even more efficient, possibly?
I mean, honestly, when I look at cards like Warden of the Inner Sky and cards like Kellen Daring Traveler, I just question, are these good or are these just weird little experiments that we have to run to figure out that they're bad? And I'm not saying I know what needs to go in place of them. And Kellen in particular might just prove out regardless because it's just a constant engine for grabbing you more creatures. But Warden of the Inner Sky, I don't know. This card feels slow and kind of clunky. It's got some interesting combos with Inti, but in general, you don't have a whole lot of counters to shove onto it. So it's not going to get to that place where it has flying and vigilance, and you don't want to waste the time to tap all these untapped artifacts and creatures to put 1+1/+1 counter on it at sorcery speed and scry 1. The other piece that I think is worth noting is that this deck looks like it gets rolled by a Sunfall. Like, there is no backup plan if they Sunfall the board. You just better have some more crap in hand to dump out because that's it. That's all you got. So this is a deck that is basically saying we have to win before Sunfall hits, and I don't love that about it. Not in this meta anyway.
Okay, all right. Well, that does it for our Tier 1 list. Let's jump down to Tier 2, and I'll kick things off with Rakdos Midrange. Rakdos Midrange came in 5th place in the hands of Soon or so on. I'm not sure. With a shocking 7 drops in the main board. How does this deck get there? Ideally, you have Iron Crag, the 2 copies of Celestis, full play set of big scores, all of these allowing the deck to ramp towards the 6 to 7 drop slots. You have 2 Virtues here, 3 Goat Throats, 3 Edicts, and a couple of copies of Brotherhood's End in the main to indicate this deck is poised against the many low-to-the-ground aggro strategies present at the moment. This deck also seeks to overwhelm with, copies of Chandra, Breach, and Atali at the top end, hoping to go bigger than the Atraxa decks. Sadly, though, I'm not sure this deck can race Domain the way it wishes to without encountering some sort of disruption on the way in that matchup.
So, Max, looking here, the plan feels like you just want to wrath the board until you can launch some giant threats at the opponent. Are there concerns, in your opinion, about opposing counterspells? Because this deck does not play Cavern of Souls.
That is correct. No, I think honestly what this deck wants to do is force the opponent to have it and have it on time. Unfortunately, with the artifact enchantment removal that we're seeing, Celestis, Iron Crag, those are kind of questionable. That's some of the disruption I was talking about. I just don't know. I think it's hedging its bet on there being a lot more hyper aggro in the meta than control.
Fair. Well, I'll tell you what, let's move it on to the deck that everybody thought was going to come out swinging in Tier 1 status, and yet is relegated to Tier 2 to start this whole meta. Talk to us about Domain, Max.
Shatoon had the sole Domain copy in the top 16, featuring minor shifts in the form of losing a Mirrex and a basic land in exchange for the Twin Cavern of Souls. 2 copies of Courier's Briefcase means pilots have seen the value in this card, up from 1 copy in both the early and the late game. This iteration also dials Atraxa back to just a 3 of, uses the remaining slots from that adjustment and a few others, namely going back to 4x Sunfall instead of the 6 to 8 board wipes we were used to seeing, to slot in Virtue of Persistence. This to me indicates again the presence in high numbers of creature-based hyper aggro strategies. Other than that, not many other shifts to ramp Domain, other than these slight adjustments.
So, I mean, this got a top 16 slot, didn't even hit the top 8. Why do you think that Domain, I mean, it's everywhere on the ladder. I think we can both attest to having seen it many, many times over this last week. Why do you think it's underperforming, though?
I have a pretty solid theory that I think Brewers are really betting on beating Domain versus figuring out Domain. Domain seems to be a solved puzzle. As I said, very slight adjustments. So I think people are betting week 1 on beating Domain being the play to make it to the top 8. So I think that's part of the reason why, honestly. And the other piece is, we're seeing Control trying to hold down the hyper aggro, and Domain is catching some of the flack from Control being in higher numbers as well.
Makes sense. And now it is time for my favorite segment, Brewer's Corner. Let's kick things off with Boros Midrange. Now, credit here to Athena the Bun. Appreciate you letting us know that this archetype even existed. I frankly did not even know about it until she talked to us about it. But this has some pretty crazy things that it can do. If you go nuts, let's say you hit the lottery ticket on this, what you can do on turn 6 is go Trumpeting Carnosaur, Discover into Quint, Discover into Geological, Discover into Wedding Announcement. I have done that one time. And for those of you counting at home, that is paying 6 mana for 18 mana worth of spells. That is an insane bargain. All right, that's kind of like you're casting a mini Omniscience in one turn. It lets the deck catch up. All this Discover, it really does let the deck catch up quickly. And Quintorius, that passive ability is wildly effective. I did not think it was going to matter. It mattered a ton. A few other things that are worth noting. Heartflame Duelist here is much better than I thought it would be. Like, yeah, you're going to hit it for 3 damage, and sometimes that's relevant, but many times you're just playing it as a 3-1, and then later in the game, you're swinging in, they're swinging in, whatever, Witchstalker gain 5 life. Like, when you get to just deal 5, gain 5, that is a huge shift. So this deck actually recovers better than many that I've seen in the past. Either way, it's a spicy number. I'm going to keep testing it. It's a ton of fun.
Sounds really fun. And I have for us today, credit to Salt Miner Chad, is it Pirates?
Yeah.
All right, so one thing I want to point out is Dire Flail, the flip side of this, which 5 mana, easy to get to when you're flipping and touching as many cards as you are with this deck, doing some exploration. But Dire Blunderbuss is a cannon. I imagine that there are going to be some chances for this card to go off. Tomb Raider is easily a 2-2 when you play this with the 4 copies of Spyglass Siren, really enabling that card to be a 2-2 just about every time. Captain Storm easily gets triggers here as well from that synergy. And then, of course, you have Malcolm and the Crewmate, which are helping you touch as many cards as possible, something that I think is a bit undervalued and that this set has really highlighted with the Explore mechanic. Just how valuable it is to go through your deck as quickly as possible. The 3 Schooners, very, very exciting powerhouse of a card, especially because you have so many creatures that can crew it and benefit from it. The Larcenist, great tempo play, really shuts off the likes of Shelly or some of the more popular artifacts that are seeing play right now in Standard. And Breaches, oh my god, Breaches is the MVP. Really nice tempo play, shutting off a blocker, valuable thing that you can do with the hyper aggro list.
Honestly, Max, I just love the flavor text on Staunch Crewmate that says, quote, leave you? Not a chance. You still owe me money. Fucking perfect. You know what I mean? Like, in terms
That's
of flavor,
awesome.
what a win. What a win, Wizards. Well played.
Great pirate lore. Oh, yeah.
Now, let's get into another list here. It is one that we've been working on in our Discord. Check out Zergo Control. I'll move some stuff around so you guys can see it. The point of this deck is that we initially sat down and we thought, how do we build Control? And one of the things that we quickly discovered is that if you play Cavern of Souls and name Orc or Dragon, Zergo is pretty impossible to deal with. It just uncounterably hits the battlefield with hexproof and haste, and will draw you a card, hit them for 4, and come right back to your hand, so they can't even wrath it the next turn unless you want them to have that ability. I don't know. I love where this deck's trying to go. I know you look at all these counters and you think, how are we dealing with Cavern of Souls? First and foremost, Confounding Riddle does a great job of saying, you've got Cavern, fine, I'll look for a Wrath effect. It's okay. We'll just go grab a Sunfall. We don't have to worry. That I've loved a lot. The second part is that Change the Equation has been paying some weird dividends. It is really beneficent to deal with a lot of Domains crap, where they want to do those Topiary Stompers and Invasions, and at 2 mana you're just like, nah, hard counter, not dealing with any of that today. And it's still relevant against most of the aggro decks, because even late game, they play a lot of 1 and 2 drops, and you're just going, no, not dealing with that either.
That's spicy. I was wondering when Change the Equation was going to see any kind of relevance, and I think right now, with some of the cards that are getting play in Domain especially, very cool, very cool. I have for us an old deck come back to life, 5-color humans or Joda. Credit to Optimal MTG for bringing this back. It was exciting when it first came out, and then kind of just stopped seeing any kind of play. really, it's sort of a toolbox deck of sorts with humans that have and serve different purposes throughout the curve. A lot of this deck is enabled by one of the 3 copies of Catilda. Once you get that in play, you can pretty much pay for anything in the deck. And then Adeline, along with Animpakal, adding to the go wide strategy, really distorting what your aggressive, clogging up the battlefield, distorting what your aggressive opponent can do to you. And then Urtai, a tempo play so that you can make it all the way down to Joda. And I also want to point out the 3 Peacekeepers in the sideboard, used for a little bit of disruption so that you can play out your creature-centered combo. Get to Jonah. That's really the game plan in this deck, right?
Yeah, and I love that there's Nightclubber in here. If you guys were looking for a great way to deal with Azorius soldiers, just play a shitload of Nightclubbers and enjoy it, because they have a lot of X1s that you get to blow out just by playing it or blitzing it.
That's spicy.
All right, and that'll bring us to our final segment, predictions for the upcoming set release. Now, Max, we've looked at 10 archetypes tonight. What are your predictions going into week 2 of Ixalan Standard?
I must say we finally made it here at the end of our first week into what has really been an exciting new set. I know it's been commented in our Discord, and I also am of the opinion that I feel like I just haven't had enough time to try everything I've wanted to try to this point. Ixalan has pushed high energy creature strategies more than any set in recent history, really, with regard to Standard. And one really has to wonder what could have been had we in fact been able to rotate this year. But nonetheless, I still believe, despite the existence of cards like Sunfall and Farewell, that we're in the midst of exciting shifts in the meta. Boros Aggro, Azorius Soldiers are both evidence that control is not everything, and Cavern of Souls is having an impact early on in the cycle already. How will control decks bounce back? I'm interested to see what shifts, if any, come around next week. Rakdos, how do you see things shaking out?
So, my hot take here is that I think Mono Red is going to fall off a cliff by week 3, if not week 2. I don't think this deck has changed much, which means it still has the same problems as the previous meta, which relegated it to tier 1.5 to 3 depending on the weekend. I also believe we'll actually see Domain kept out of the top tier through sheer force of Tempo decks that are seeing play. Esper Mid is already shifting to address weaknesses in their matchup with the disruptive bats, and it also gains a potent weapon for pushing back against Sunfall via the Schooner. Meanwhile, Azorius Soldiers gains more consistency with Malcolm and nearly a strict removal upgrade with Get Lost. I'd expect to see both of these archetypes fine-tune the numbers but continue to put up results as we go. Last but not least, I do expect to see an uptick in control and Golgari over the next few weeks. Zurgo may not be the play, but uncounterable, unkillable threats that produce card advantage while not interfering with your Wrath ability ain't too shabby, and this deck can play through the Cavern of Souls issue that will hamper other control variants. Golgari, on the other hand, has mostly been held in check by Domain, so if we see Atraxa deck disappear, expect Shelly and friends to come back as the dominant mid-range option to punish the non-believers.
Oh boy, it's going to be an exciting week 2 in Ixalan, so be sure to stay ahead of the pack by tuning in every week to these videos. Leave us a comment on anything we've discussed today regarding Standard, and let us know how you see the meta shifting over the coming weeks. While you're there, like and subscribe for more States of the Meta, our podcast, draft guides, and shorts. Also, if you can support us even further by joining the Rebellion down below at either $1 or $3 a month, we would be grateful to you, and thanks to anyone who's already shown us that love just in the first month alone.
Until next time, untap, upkeep, resist.
Resist.